This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on third-party issues, state board issues, contracting, pharmacy purchase and sales issues, and more, especially in the context of fraud and compliance. Reach out now at darshan@kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. You can also just visit our website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's Kulkarni lawfirm.com. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. My name is Darshan Kulkarni. I'm really excited to have with us our latest guest, Sarah Ziegler, and I'm going to talk to her about biosafety monitoring because I am curious about what this means and how it specifically ties into clinical trials, because it's not something I have heard too much about, but it is an emerging area, so I'm very, very curious about it. So before we get started, Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you. And I want to say thank you for having me on the show today. My name is Sarah Ziegler. I am started off as a trained scientist, so a basic, person who was in the backyard digging around, trying to investigate things. And then I watched the movie Outbreak and saw all these people in crazy suits trying to cure diseases, and I decided I wanted to do that someday. So I got into the field of biocontainment and high and maximum containment. So I have worn those crazy suits before, worked in a research lab. And then about 10 years ago, I made the switch over to biosafety. And in biosafety, what we're doing is we are training scientists so that they can do all of those crazy things safer. And more recently, I've really gotten a little bit away from the bench, but also looking at how we can put biosafety in a clinical setting. So really, I do this field because of the people. Like I want to keep the people safe, and I want to make sure science can keep moving forward. And so in order to do that, we got to keep the scientists safe. So that's a little bit about me.
I love it, and thank you for that introduction. It's interesting. Whenever I think about biosafety, it's always been in the from the lens of sort of GLP, good lab practices, and then, as you put it, in the fancy lab outfits that people from the CDC probably wear when a pandemic hits, and all of us have some recent experience with that. So, you see pictures from like China where people are being moved around by people in these biohazardous suits. So, and I'm sure it happened in the U.S. as well, just to be clear. But the point being, it's that's what I visualize. But you're talking about this emerging area where you're taking those principles and applying them to a clinical setting, and more specifically to a clinical research setting. So, talk to me a little bit about how emerging is this? Is this something that people even understand that there's a need for?
I would say that there's really an unmet need, and some people don't even realize that they need it in a clinical setting. So, the first time I really saw this come out was when we had the Ebola epidemic in the 2014 2015 timeframe. And if you'll remember, there was a nurse in Texas who unfortunately actually got Ebola from a patient that she was treating. And this really brought to light the idea that we need to be working to keep our nurses and our doctors and everyone in a hospital clinical setting safe from the patients. So this is an idea that we've been doing in the research field for a long time. We think about keeping our scientists safe working in a lab bench, and that's a lot of our focus. But in a hospital or a clinical setting, we focus a lot on patients, as it should be. I mean, their job is to treat patients and keep them safe and try not to spread any infections that direction. But we don't focus as much on nurses and doctors. So not only did Ebola bring this to light, where we needed to start keeping our doctors and nurses safe, but also then COVID is another example where we started to talk about how do we make sure our nurses and doctors are safe? How are we protecting them? So they weren't bringing it home to their families. And that's really where biosafety it comes into a clinical setting. Honestly, it's really new and emerging. We've been in education and institutions like that for many, many years, but coming into a clinical research setting is much newer.
Fair enough. So let me ask you this question. I recently saw something in the news where one of the politics, like we just recently had the elections all across the country, and I saw something where it said one of the politicians got anthrax in the mail, and again, the people with the biohazardous suits walked out and tried to help around with that. So my question for you is it obviously there are clinical implications, but is the natural path to clinical research through actual treatment protocols? And what I mean by that is, are we going to be able to get people to start thinking about biosafety starting from clinical research, or is it better to first go, we need to get doctors used to the idea of wearing these outfits, and that means that starting from putting people into these suits and walking through the halls, and that being normalized? Because right now, I mean, I worked in a hospital for, well, almost 20 years. That's scary. But I worked in a hospital for a long time, and I know that it's seen as being in the way almost. So how do you see the future of biosafety being incorporated into the culture of safety that needs to occur?
So those were a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to hit them.
Yes.
Um, First off, I hope we never get to the point where it's normalized that doctors are wearing big bulky suits in a hospital. I don't think we're at that point for everyday types of things. Like when we have the Ebola, the COVID, or something really bad out there, whatever the next emerging disease, yeah, that might be necessary. But they are big and bulky and they hinder things. And there's also social implications. You want to personalize your doctors. And when you start putting them behind masks and things like that, they stop being a person. So I'll start with that. How are we going to break into that field? So right now, there is a huge upswing in human gene therapy products, and that's coming into the clinical research area. When you're working with human gene therapy products and you have different types of federal funding, there's actually a requirement for you to have what's called an IBC, or an Institutional Biosafety Committee, for those sites. So this is where I see biosafety coming into the field, is these clinical research sites, or IBCs. So this is actually a regulation and a mandate. At this point in time, we only have 18 human gene therapy products that are approved through the FDA, but the pipeline for these type of products is just going through the roof. So there's been a huge upswing in the need for institutional biosafety committees at clinical trial sites. So I think that's the first place where we start breaking kind of into this field. But I also see it as partnering with hospitals in a kind of a different way. As we see workers who are frustrated that they're not being safe, or they have infectious diseases like COVID or something like that, then I think bringing in biosafety practices into that realm is something we can look at. But I think we need to be really careful. Biosafety officers can't come into a hospital and tell everyone to wear suits. Like we're never gonna get to that point. But we could start like really easy stuff. So one thing when I've worked at hospitals, so a lot of times our academic institutions are partnered with hospitals. And you go to the cafeteria. If you walk into a cafeteria, doctors are wearing their white lab coats in the cafeteria. And this is always one of those head scratchers for us from the research side. So we are taught over and over, the lab coat stays in the lab. The point is you protect your clothes, it stays in the lab. But doctors are wearing their lab coats everywhere. They go to the cafeteria with them, it goes in their car, it goes home, all of these places. That lab coat for a doctor is a status symbol. But for a biosafety person, that's PPE, that's protection of your clothes. So it's something as simple as, hey, let's leave our lab coats in a locker in the hospital. Let's not wear them to the cafeteria. So some of these basic biosafety principles could come into place, and they would be making people safer. They'd make our workers safer, our surrounding communities, things like that. I think those are the ways that biosafety professionals kind of need to breach this and cover the gap.
That's really kind of interesting. So let me start by asking. So biosafety, obviously, there are both clinical and clinical trial implications. I'm going to just sort of speak across both for now, and then we can specify as necessary. But do you see a a need for a specific committee that manages biosafety, or is it going to quote unquote permeate the actual organization? You gave an example of permeation, if you will, of that culture being created. So let me ask you that first question before I go into the next one.
So I think biosafety committees are essential because while you have a single biosafety officer, if you have a huge institution, there's no way that one person can permeate a culture. So having people on a biosafety committee and having them have a voice in what their safety looks like, what the needs are, they also become your advocates throughout the institution. So I think biosafety communities are very important. I think it's important that people have a say in their safety. So we don't get to the point where safety just feels like a dictatorship or, safety cops is something that's heard a lot. And we never want safety cops. We want safety culture. So I think committees are important. And when you make those committees, it's not like a high level committee. It's a committee that has representation from everyone, from the cafeteria worker, the janitor, to the nurses, to the doctors, to the techs. Like you have that permeation.
I love that. So how do you avoid biosafety becoming, for lack of a better term, security theater? And what I mean by that is, for those people who don't know, one of the things they talk about is when you go through security at the airport, they make you remove your shoes and they make you unpack your bags so that it goes through. And there have been tons of studies showing that it doesn't really do much in the overall scheme of things, and it's not very effective. However, people feel safer doing that. Do you worry about biosafety becoming more security theater than the actual impact, which is the culture changing to be more safe, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. And and I know what you're talking about, but I think what's important is what we do in biosafety is a risk assessment. So we go in and we actually look at where are the hazards, how likely are they to happen, what are the implications for that, and then you put in mitigation factors or safety protocols that are specific for the risk. For an example, if you have a problem with needle sticks in your clinical setting, we're not going to go in and tell people to wear masks. Like this doesn't these don't correlate, and unfortunately sometimes we get in this idea of, well, you always need to do certain things. I think we need to make sure that the risk and what we're seeing actually fits the mitigation we put in place and that it's staged. This is not a one size fits all type of situation. And we need to make sure that the mitigation we put in place actually fits the risks and where they are.
Now, I admit that I'm coming to this from a very um, naive standpoint, so I appreciate you indulging my questions. But, I just pulled from the airport example. Another example that sticks out to me is the police. And what I think about is police have SWAT teams that come in who are specialized. All they do is SWAT type of work, and they are trained to handle unique special circumstances. In the same way, do you see biosafety being a SWAT team for regular protocols, or do you see, again, going back to the culture part of it, is it something that is just a normal escalation of what already exists?
I don't think of it as a SWAT team because I think that when we're in like a clinical setting, the risks are there even at the lowest risk, and that's just bloodborne pathogens in people. So I don't think we could say that there's an area where you wouldn't need biosafety, but there is a natural escalation of it. And I think that that's what's important is that people can see the escalation because what happens if you over I don't want to say like put in too many safety protocols for something that's really simple and not very risky, then people start to disregard it when you get to something that is very risky.
I love that. So that takes us back to the question or the comment you'd raised a few minutes ago, which was this idea of who should be helping assess those risks. And you talked about a wide variety of individuals, whether it's the janitor, whether it's a cafeteria worker, whether it's the cleaning staff that's coming through, all the way through the nurses, the doctors, the pharmacists, and others. Um, Do you the hospital environment or the clinical environment, whether or not we like it, is a very hierarchical environment. And it sounds great in principle to say we're going to have everyone have that kumbaya moment, come together and do all those things because, quite honestly, it's necessary. Um, but it reminds me of this scene. I read about this situation where the old Planet of the Apes movies. Turns out, have you heard of this example? Or okay, so in the old Planet of the Apes movies, you had like the chimpanzees. I'm making up examples, but the chimpanzees, the orangutans, and whatever other monkey type there was. And turns out that people who were dressed up as the chimpanzees would only hang out with the people who were dressed up as the chimpanzees, and the orangutans only with the orangutans. My point being, um, what you need to do a good biosafety program is that, excuse my language, but all the monkeys come together and have a conversation. Um, how do you get past the natural resistance? No one's going to come out and say, I don't want to, but how do you break those barriers down?
So those barriers exist not just in hospitals. I mean, they exist in a university. So, we have scientists, who have been there for 25 years,
Yeah.
and I can't tell you how many times I've heard, well, we've been doing it this way for X amount of years. Why do we have to change type of thing? So it's
Right.
something that as a biosafety officer, we've been we've been trained to deal with. And it's really on the individual standpoint. You have to find out what value is important to them, and then make sure that you can fit their needs for what's important. Now, the point of bringing everyone together, it's to understand that everyone sees different risks and everyone's at risk. So, talking specifically about janitors, I mean, there are a lot of times needles get disposed of in the wrong way. A janitor puts their hand in a trash can and they get a needle stick. So, if we're talking, needle sticks are the easy one to talk about because everyone understands them. Doctors usually don't handle needles very much if you think about it. I mean, it's more of your nursing staff and some of your other techs. But nobody would think about how are we saving our janitors from needle sticks. So
Yeah.
it's something that's very cross-functional, and getting representatives from people in there to talk about it, then I think then they start to realize that they don't get this, like, what do I want to say, tunnel vision. Like if I just brought nurses in, they only think about what they're doing. Or if I just brought doctors in, they're only going to think about their doing. But if we talk about a hospital as a whole, then they could see how everyone fits together. And I mean, there are always bad apples in every place. Sometimes it's fun to put them on a committee, because then you get the squeakiest wheel in there and then they start to hear the voice of everyone else. Sometimes you put them a little bit separately and you handle them one on one. But that's going to happen no matter where you're at. But in general, people, I mean, they're good people and people care about each other, and they're not going to come out and say, oh, I want you to get a needle stick, I want you to get sick. Nobody's going to
Right.
want that. So actually bringing everyone together is probably the easier part. I think the hardest part is when you get into like administration, because then it's dollars, and so then the reason to bring in biosafety becomes a financial thing, and you have to start coming up with reasons to convince them of what to do, because unfortunately sometimes safety has dollar
Yeah.
implications to it. But then you start talking about turnover rates. If your staff feels safe, then they're happier. You can also talk about people calling out to work and staffing levels as well. If your staff is getting sick a lot, then, they're not coming into work. And then, I mean, if you really have to, you can start talking about compliance and regulations and things like that. But I hate playing that card because then you start getting into that safety cop kind of mentality. I would much rather have people want to be safe than tell them they're required to be safe.
Right. So two comments. The first one being, welcome to my world where I am safety cop all the time. But and it's not even just safety; it's risk cop. So it's not even necessarily I can point to a specific safety issue. I'm just saying, risk-wise, do you really want to expose yourself? But that's always fun. But you talked a little bit about representation. You talked about the value of bringing people together, which I completely agree with. Most people aren't um, terrible people going, I don't care about this. However, what I do hear often is, do I have to be in on this meeting because I'm not adding anything? I'm on like 19 other committees. What value am I adding to needle sticks? I'm the doctor. I don't actually use needles. Why don't you have the nurses and the janitors talk, and I'll show up on the meetings you need me to? So how do you land up to create that culture? Do you land up with a scenario where you need everyone to be present, or just the most important people, and then you spread the message? How do you tend to handle those conversations?
So I like to have a representative from a group, or maybe it's two representatives from a group. I don't like to force people to be on a committee. So I want people to volunteer who want to be on the committee. So maybe somebody on like a doctor, like you said, maybe they're super busy and they don't want to be on another committee because they're on 20 other committees. Well, maybe I can find like a junior doctor. Maybe I can find somebody who doesn't be on, who's not on 15 committees, who can come in and give representation. You could also do it part of like promotion. Maybe there's a doctor who's not on as much, but they want to, what do I want to say, increase their value for the institution. So being able to put something on their resume that they were on the biosafety committee, that's another resume builder for them as well. So I think like I can give you lots of examples, but it's very individualized. There's lots of strategies for this. It's people management when it comes down to it, and being able to deal with people, and it comes down to finding out what's important to them and incentivizing them to do it. And I mean, you're not going to win everyone. Unfortunately, that's just the way it goes. Like there are some people who you're never going to win over, and they're
Right.
always going to say that this is not necessary, but you need to work for the others.
I'm going to ask you to pull the card that you avoid pulling. So talk to me a little bit about the laws and the regulations that require biosafety to exist.
Absolutely. So, as far as a clinical research site, there's what's called the NIH guidelines. So, back in the 70s and 80s, when genetic mutations started coming on the scene, there were groups of people who were very scared about, genetic manipulations and making Andromeda strain viruses, things of that nature. So, 70s and 80s. And then the NIH guidelines were created at that time. And the guidelines say that if you are doing anything with DNA mutations, we call it recombinant or synthetic nucleic acids, that you must have an institutional biosafety committee. And this is a guideline if you are receiving any kind of NIH funding. So if the product received NIH funding at any time, or the institution as a whole receives NIH funding. There are some other national funding ways that if you're getting that funding, you're also required to do NIH guidelines. So there's some other funding agencies that kind of tack into it. But that is the specific guideline or regulation that's necessary, like in a clinical research site, to have biosafety. In some other ways, that's gets caught up, like if you need a permit, like if you're working with an agent that you need a permit for, you may be required to have biosafety. And then there's something called select agents. So you brought up anthrax before. So these agents that have been listed by the government to be bioterrorism agents, those also require very specific regulations for biosafety. So those are kind of the real guidelines and CFRs and things like that, legal ways that we need to have biosafety.
So that's interesting. So you talk about the NIH guidelines, the use of permits, the use of the presence of select agents. What I didn't hear you mention is OSHA. How does all this tie into OSHA?
So OSHA is a little bit separate. So as a biosafety officer, I'm trained in OSHA. I have all of those OSHA requirements, but usually biosafety departments in larger institutions is a little bit separate from our safety and our OSHA requirements. The one OSHA requirement that we usually work with that's overlap is the bloodborne pathogen standard. And so that is an OSHA standard. And as far as bloodborne pathogens, we could get in the details of that. But that is a requirement that if you're working with needles, that you've looked at safety engineered sharps, the way you dispose of those sharps, making sure you have like an exposure control plan. But it does not require biosafety. Normally, though, I will say if we have a biosafety office in there, usually the bloodborne pathogen kind of gets punted to the biosafety officer because has that microbiological aspect to it, and then we can loop it into our biosafety programs.
So we're ta- so it becomes a component of, or at least a starting point, if you will, for a
Yes.
biosafety officer. Is that you mentioned the laws, the primary laws and regulations that apply are really the NIH guidelines that start, and then the permits and the select agents, if you will. But those all primarily sound like U.S. based issues. Is the requirement for a independent biosafety commission or a committee primarily a U.S. thing, or is there a global impact, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is, I will say that US is probably at the forefront of biosafety, and we have the most, but is definitely an international thing. So internationally, the guidelines we would use would be the WHO. So the WHO actually has biosafety guidelines. And then in 2020, there was an ISO standard that was put in place. It's called the Biorisk Management. So biorisk is kind of just another name for biosafety. And so the ISO standard is something that we see internationally. And as far as like requirements come, then it would be on an individual country aspect. But mostly internationally, they're going to follow WHO guidelines. Canada also has a very rigorous biosafety program as well. But as far as NIH and IBC guidelines, that's very US based.
Very, very interesting. We can keep going, but we're well past time at this point. So before we get going, how can people reach you?
Sure. So I am the Vice President of Biosafety and IBC Services at Cetero. And so you can reach me with any questions about biosafety. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this. So my email address is sarah.ziegler@cetero.com. And so I welcome anyone to reach out with questions, concerns, anything like that.
Awesome. Again, Sarah, this was amazing. Thank you so much for your help, and I'm looking forward to talking to you further about biosafety.
Absolutely.
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an